I'm the grandfather of Sarah Jarvis, and she asked me to describe one of my missions over Germany in World War II. I was a pilot in a B-17. Now, B-17 was a large bomber. It was extensively used in Europe and carried a crew of 10 members. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and 6 gunners. And so every one of these missions was a bit different. Some of them we made into Munich, Berlin. I was on the first daylight raid over Berlin. And the mission that I'm going to talk about is a mission that I was making on April the 22nd of 1944. It was a mission that early in the morning had been scrubbed. That is, because of low clouds and fog and so forth, we couldn't make a run. My crew and I had decided, well, since we weren't going to be flying that day, we'd go into London, catch the train and go to London. But about noon, they called us and said they had a short mission. Now that meant that mission was not going to be longer than 6 hours. The other ones had been 8 and 9 hours. So we were looking forward to this because when you got 25 missions in over enemy territory, they'd send you back to the States. So this was going to be our 23rd, and we were really looking forward to getting to come home. And this mission was to Ham, Germany. Now Ham was a city in the Ruhr Valley, famous for its steel mills, and since it was on the northern end of that valley, it was also a terminal for railroads, switch yards and what have you. So those were our targets, the steel mills or the railroad yards. And we were going to fly, the lead airplane was at 18,000 feet, and I was going to be over the target at 21,000 feet. Because as you were back towards the back, each one raised up, each unit, each squadron, and so I was going over the target at 21,000 feet. Now, it just happened that they had some excellent gunners shooting anti-aircraft, and the flak hit the plane that I was flying. It hit just between the first and second engine out here on the left, and the wing began to curl up. So, you know, there wasn't any problem. We didn't have to second guess what we could do with it. We had to get out of it. And the plane was turning to the left and going away from the target area. And so I rang the bailout bell, and all of the crew, all 10 members of us, were to get out of that airplane as quickly as we could. And of course, everybody knew that we'd been hit because by that time there was smoke coming out of the engine and it was on fire. And when I bailed out, I was at the altimeter in the airplane said 14,000 feet. Now, that was the first time I'd ever made a parachute jump. You don't practice those things in the military, in the Air Force, unless it's a real thing. So I bailed out. Now, in my mind, the minute I jumped out of that airplane, I knew that I wanted to get back to England as quickly as I could. And I didn't want to spend time in a prisoner of war camp. I also knew that to do so, I would have to delay my opening of my parachute. I had to get down close to the ground because other people that I had talked to and that had come by and talked about jumping out and bailing out of airplanes explained to us that if you open your parachute and you're high, you're going to take 5-10 minutes to get to the ground, and by that time one of the Germans will have a Jeep up there and they'll be waiting on you. And so I decided that I would not pull that ripcord. By the way, if you're talking about a ripcord, this is a ripcord right here. I'll cover my face up with a ripcord. This is the handle, sticks out the parachute, and when you're ready, you just give it a yank. And frankly, in my stead, since I did not know that that thing was going to work, I prayed a little bit about, boy, please get this parachute open. and get me down on the ground safely. Well, the parachute, as I was free falling, I could not get into the position that I thought was necessary. I was falling on my back, and I didn't know how to turn myself over. I've watched since, and these people do all kind of tricks in the air, but this old boy didn't know how to do it. And so I just watched over my shoulder. And from experience, I could make an estimate of how high I was from the ground. And I cut it pretty close, because when I finally pulled my ripcord and the chute opened, I made one swing out, and on the next swing back in, I hit the ground. It's just like you would put your feet down on a place swing. You know when you come down, then you're on the ground. And we had been advised that if we were going to try and get away, we were to bury our parachutes, do anything we had to just to eliminate anybody knowing we was on the ground. Well, it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, April the 22nd, as I said, and about the same latitude as Dallas, or we are here. And at 9 o'clock, it was not quite dark. There was still some light. But I hit that ground. I unbuckled the parachute. I saw where the plane had hit the ground. While I was coming down, I saw that. And it burst into flame. And I looked up, and I could see my other crew members up, some of them up 10,000 feet in the air yet, and I was on the ground. But I started taking off. I didn't bury my parachute. I headed right away from that area. And then it was dark very soon after, and I was traveling at night, and I'm an old Boy Scout. I looked for the North Star, and my intentions were strictly to get back to the North Sea, into the Channel area, and maybe steal a boat or something. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there, but my intention was to get back to England as quickly as I could. Well, I started walking, and they had told us, do not walk on railroad tracks or down railroad tracks, do not cross bridges. These kind of things will be guarded by the Germans. So I stayed out in the fields, walking, and there were a lot of small canals. I'd call them irrigation ditches to you and I. And then finally I came to a big one. I mean, it was big. And I started wading off in that thing. I'd waded through others. I was wet, traveling in a good uniform. Didn't have my flight clothes with me because this had been called when we were going to go to London. We didn't change into flight clothes. I just wore my dress uniform to make this, quote, short mission. And as I went along, I got to this big canal, and right down the canal a short distance was a bridge. And I thought, man, if I've got to wade these all night, to get back to the coast, I believe I'd just go up there and check that bridge out. And if there was nobody on it, from then on I was going to walk across the bridges. Well, I got over close to the bridge, and I could see that there was nobody around that bridge any place, and it was a railroad bridge. So I walked up on that railroad, went across that bridge, and for the remainder of the night, I walked straight through towns and little villages, but I stayed right on that railroad. And dogs would bark, but nobody investigated. And so come early morning, beginning of daylight, I hid in some brush that night, or that morning, and trees, a little forested area, and thought, well, I'll lay in here for the day, and then at night I'll travel, and I'll get back to that coast. Second night, traveled. Third night I traveled, and the fourth night, I'd begin to get really hungry. The piece of chocolate that I had had with me had given out. I had not eaten, and I thought, now how am I going to handle this? Well, I found a barn, and it had some milk cows in it, but I couldn't milk a cow. Didn't know how, so I went up in the loft, and I thought, in the morning when somebody comes to milk this cow, I'll jump out and scare them, and then I'll have the milk. I'll wait till they have milked the animal, and I'll be able to drink some milk. Well, that was a deal that didn't make through. That morning there was a young lady came out of the house and started for the barn, and when she came into the barn, she must have heard me or sensed my presence, because she let out a scream, threw the bucket in the air, didn't come near the cow, and took back off to the house. Well, that scared me, and I took off running out of that barn, across the pasture and onto a road. And, you know, I was not in the best kept uniform, and here come a fellow riding a bicycle. He looked at me and motioned for me to come with him. Well, I was out in the open daylight. I figured he's going to help me. So I went with him, and he did. He took me, you know, just a few yards on down the road, and I stopped at his house. And he took me in the house, and he got me a piece of bread and a piece of meat. It was like a pork, a big piece of bacon like, and fed me that. And then he told me to go out his back door and down a path. Now, I did not speak German, Finnish. I didn't speak any foreign language except English, and with a lot of sign language, flying and this and that and the other, I was trying to make myself known that I was an American. Well, he sent me out that path, and I don't know whether he called the police or whether the young lady had called the police. I don't know who had called the police, but I hadn't gone very far that day, maybe a quarter of a mile, and I'd gotten on a road. Didn't know where that road led, but I was on the road, and two fellas come up beside me, and they were carrying guns, and they were dressed in police uniforms, riding bicycles, and they suggested, you know, that I follow them. And I didn't argue with them. I just figured, okay, I've been captured, and they'll take me to prison. Well, they didn't. They took me down the road a piece into another house, and they kept me there for the day. I didn't know what they were doing. They were talking and I guess deciding what to do with me. And they kept me overnight there at that house. And they didn't hurt me. I sat there against a wall, and in fact, they offered me a little food, and so I had no options that I knew of. But the next morning we got up, and well, they had also taken my wedding ring, and I think I had my dog tags. They had taken those and things of that nature, but they hadn't hurt me. But we started walking down this road. They were riding their bicycles. And this is strange, what comes into your mind as to how you're going to get loose or away from them. But I began to yell at them that I was an officer. I was a first lieutenant, and I ought to be able to ride the bike. And so I'd tell them this, you know, and scream at them and tell them I'd get off the bike. I was an officer, and I should ride the bike. Well, they wouldn't let me have their bikes. One of the fellows was short, and the other one was tall. And I don't know whether this is true to physics or not, but I thought if I could get the bike of the tall one, I could ride faster than the short fella. Now, you know, I have no idea whether that's a true statement or not, but in my mind, I thought that would probably work. And so finally, I come to an intersection, and I didn't know which way we were going. The road sort of split. And I had been yelling at him about riding the bike, and I just sat down in the intersection, sat down right on the road, and told him, I said, now, I'm not going to go anywhere. You know, I get a bike. And, you know, and they never really got their guns out. They didn't appear that they were going to shoot me. But I started yelling about this and screaming, and I noticed people begin to come around and watch this show. And when they'd get behind these two fellas, they'd hold their hands up with a V, sign for victory. And I began to think to myself, hey, these people might help me. They may, you know, they're telling me that they like me and don't like the two fellas with the guns. And So finally I got up and I got around where I could, I thought, get a hold of the tall man's bike. I got my hand up on the handlebar and just ready to push off, trying to get through, and the crowd was split, so I could have gotten out. And about that time, when I started to run with that bike, he caught the back fender. He just reached out and grabbed it, and when he did, I just turned around and threw that bike at him, and I split out, and the group of people around me probably closed in around them. I didn't stop to look. I was running away, and I ran down the road a piece, and the wheat fields were up a foot and a half, I guess the wheat was, that was there beside the road, and I chose to get off into that wheat field, and I got down and started crawling and working my way through that wheat field, and I thought, now what'll I do? Where'll I go? Well, I said, I'll go back right to that corner. I can go around this house, crawl away all the way around, and come back to that corner, and they will not look for me there because they think I run down the road. And I did, just what I had anticipated. I went all the way around in those wheat fields and come back to that intersection at that road. And it was probably by then noon, maybe 1 o'clock, I don't know. I laid there, and pretty soon they had other cars out. They run up and down the road for a while, and there were people talking, but eventually it got very quiet, and there were no cars, and there were no people talking, and I raised my head up to look around, and there was an old man sitting in a house directly across the street from where all this had been taking place. And somehow or other, he must have known that I had gone down. Maybe he watched me, I don't know, but he knew that I was laying in that field across from him, because when I raised my head up, he motioned for me to lay back. And I got to turn this off.
We have.
Get back.
You know where you was at in the speech?
Okay, had a little interruption right there. Ups delivered a package and my dog got wild. Back to the war story. I laid there till about dark, and when it began to be real dark, long about 9 o'clock, maybe 10 o'clock, this old gentleman came over to where I was laying, and he indicated for me to come with him, and so I did. I got up and we went across the street, and I went into his house, and I began to tell him that I was an American, I was a flyer, and I went through all of pantomime that I could, but he spoke no English. He just shrugged his shoulders. And I told him I didn't know for sure where I was at. I was lost. And here again, I went through all the sign languages that I could use and just talk real loud. And he just sat there and shrugged his shoulders. But I guess I'd been there maybe 30 minutes with him, and a boy came in the house, probably 10 or 11 years old. And he spoke English. Oh, was I ever glad to hear somebody that could speak English. And I told that young man, I said, now I want to get in with the underground. Where am I at? And he said to me, he said, you're in Belgium, Belgique. And I said, oh, good, I want to get in the underground. And he talked to the old man in Flemish, and the old man said he didn't know anybody in the underground. They told me this twice, and I kept insisting that I wanted to get into the underground. I wanted help. I wanted to get back to America. And so the boy, he'd tell the old man, and so finally they left, the old man and the boy. And then his wife, the elderly lady, she was sitting there, and of course she just stared at me, and I guess I stared back at her. And they were gone for about an hour. But when they returned, there were two other people with them, two men. One of them probably in his early 20s, the other a little older. And they asked me some questions. They asked me who I was. They asked me what squadron I was from, what bomb group, and who my commander was. And I gave them that information. and they told me then that they were members of the White Brigade, which was a pro-American or pro-English group working against the Germans in Belgium, and that they would try and help me. But first I would have to stay there at that house until they confirmed who I was. And so they left about 2 o'clock in the morning. They come back and they told me, all right, I would be helped by the White Brigade of Belgium to get back to England. But it would be a long trip. And that my idea of going to the coast, because I told them I wanted to get up to the coast and get a boat or something, and they told me that was impossible, that I would have to walk or ride a bicycle or travel from where I was at in Belgium, which was about 30 miles southeast of Brussels. So I was about 15 miles into Belgium from Germany at that time. And so they told me I'd have to walk, or they'd take care of me though, and they'd help me get home. Now that was on the 26th of April, and for the next few months I traveled across Belgium, across France, and into Spain. And I walked or rode a bicycle. I had some real experiences. In some places, I would stay in people's houses. People were helping me. They had this underground, was not under the ground. It was simply that they would transfer me from house number 1 to house number 2. A person, in this case in Belgium, a Belgian would take me from house number 1 and leave me at house number 2. Somebody else would come by and take me from house number 2 to house number 3. And sometimes these houses in one case, I know they were within 2 blocks of each other. But then at other times, they were a mile, they were maybe 5 miles away. And I traveled during the day. I never traveled at night. I traveled during the day. And of course, after the night that they told me they would help me, they immediately looked at my uniform and gave me some civilian clothes, had me shave, and told me from now on I was a certain person, and they gave me some papers. But my problem was I couldn't have spoke to anybody except in English, but I had papers showing that I was a worker and so forth and so on. And so we traveled during the day. Like I say, normally it would be early in the morning when people were going to work, or in the afternoon when people were coming home from work. So there were always quite a few people out on the street when I would be being moved from place to place. Things went real well for a few days, and I moved what I thought was pretty good pace. And I came to a town in Belgium, but on the border of France, Kortrijk, Belgium. And at Kortrijk, I stayed there about 2 weeks. It may have been that they were making arrangements for me to move into France, or there may have been some other problems. I know they run into problems every once in a while when they'd have some GI or some military person would stay in one of these houses, and he wouldn't move on. And this would close things down for a while until they found how to move him or how to get around that house. And so we moved. I got into Belgium, into Kortrijk, and as I say, I stayed with a family about 2 weeks. And I have a book here, and this book has a number of the pictures in it that I stayed with. These people corresponded with me after the World War II. In fact, they had reasons for me to leave my name and leave my address. And of course, that was my parents' address. And they corresponded, and they sent me pictures after World War II. And some of them are pictures that I'm in with the Belgian people. and some of the French people. Anyhow, one night sitting there in Belgium, we could hear at Kortrijk when the English who flew the night missions, and a plane had come over and left some flares, dropped some flares there in Kortrijk, Belgium. And the Belgians said, oh, they're going to bomb the town. And I had never been in a bombing raid on the ground, and so when they began to talk about it and they were going to go to their bomb shelter, I decided I'd go on. I was sort of out at the outskirts of the city, and I would go up and sit on the roof and watch this. And I'll tell you what, it was a real display of firepower as those bombs began to drop there in the middle of that town, because they were knocking a railroad out that had troop trains parked in a rail yard. And so I'm sitting up there on that rooftop watching this, and there was some anti-aircraft fire going on. They had guns across the street firing at these planes. And those planes, the English did not fly as high as the Americans. Their old Lancaster, which was their big bomber, would come in at about 12,000 feet. Well, they hit one of them. And that bombardier had released his bombs so that they were coming out one at a time on a synchronized pattern. And that pattern looked to me like you're going to hit the house I was sitting on top of. Now, you want to know how fast a fella can get from there? I don't know, but I was in that bomb shelter real quick. And the Belgians, God, I still couldn't speak any Belgian, Flemish. They was laughing at how I come rushing in there to get away from those bombs. Then came the event of moving from Belgium into France. Here again, in briefings, we had been told that when you get to the border, you may have to wait 3 or 4 days and watch how the guards change, and maybe find just the right time that you can get between two groups of guards or something. Well, they told me, they said, tomorrow we're going to hand you over to the French. Now, all this white brigade, or these people that were pro-Ally, were young people. I really didn't run into any of them that was, say, over 30, 35 years old. The leader of it, or the commander of the white brigade, his name was Richard, and I have a picture of him, and he was 22 years old. Now, they set out and laughed, because at night sometimes they would tell the police that there was a parachute out here in the forest someplace, the American or Englishman. They had seen him. And then when they'd send a patrol out, they'd kill that patrol. They'd kill the members of that patrol and bury them out there in the forest and come in and joke about it. But, it was a war. It was real. Anyhow, the day that I was going to go over into France, I got all prepared. A fellow knocked at the door and told me to come with him. We were going to go about 2 miles and we would be in France. So we began to walk, and finally we come to this little town, and I could see right straight ahead of me the barricades across the road and a little guard's hut there. And he told me, and he spoke English to me, and he said, now you just follow along behind me about a quarter of a block, and you watch me, and you keep looking in the windows as we go by these stores, and when I get down there and after I have talked to the guard, I will either come back or I will motion for you to come to me. So sure enough, he got down there and he talked to this guard for a while, and pretty soon he motioned for me to come to him. So I was walking on down there to the guard, and as I get to the guard, he grabs me, shakes me, hugs me, and great American. And he yells at a person who is a half a block away at another guard post, come, I have an American up here. Well, it turned out that they too belonged to the French underground, but they were guards for the German on these border gates. And so when he got through hugging me and talking to me and the other man and telling him that I was a pilot and I had bailed out and I had come across Belgium, then he motioned for me to go over and meet a fella in France who was going to lead me in France. And I went over there. I couldn't speak French either. So I got in with this man, and I'm walking beside him, and we go, I think it was about 4 miles into Lille, France. Pretty good sized city, the largest French city that I had been in at any time, and was the largest French city I think that I was in during the time that I went from there at that guard post all the way across France and into Spain. Now, I did not know what to expect. I went into Lille with this man. He takes me up to a bar, to a pub. And there I'm greeted by a family. And this family was unique to me in that they owned a hotel in Detroit, Michigan. They had gone back to visit their families and had been caught in the Blitzkrieg when the German tanks rolled around them and closed off their escape. And this was one of their family bars, and so they just stayed there. Of course, they were French, and but they had a little boy, and they wanted him to come to America and go to school. Never forget that. Whatever I could do to help him get to school when I got back into the United States. In France, the one thing they learned very quickly was that I loved French fried potatoes. And they served French fried potatoes to me just like every place I'd stop, the word would go on in front of me. This man likes French fried potatoes. And they were serving them like popcorn, big bowls of them, of French fried potatoes, sit down, and I'm to eat them things. Only one incident in my food category that I can recall, really. I was in a house, and I got up that morning, slept there that night, and I got up and I come down the stairs, and oh, the odor was terrible. I couldn't imagine what it was. And everybody was gone, so I got nosing around, and out on the kitchen table, I found a ball of cheese, maybe 8-10 inches in diameter, big ball of cheese, and oh, the odor was terrible, and I thought, what in the world? Well, it wasn't a few minutes, here come the gentleman of the house, and he greeted me in French. I'm sitting there looking out the window, and he went in the kitchen, got that ball of cheese, and put it in a sack, his pouch, and took off on his bicycle with that. In about 45 minutes, he come back with some groceries. And he had traded this ball of cheese to somebody for groceries, for food for us to eat. And I never forgot that. His wife, when she came in from work, she could speak some English. And I asked her, I said something about that cheese. And, very expensive, very expensive. And I said, well, where did you get this cheese? And she says, my husband makes cheese, and he puts it out in the dung pile to age. Oh, and that's what I was smelling. Another incident along this line, of course, my father had received information from the Air Force that I was missing in action, and that I had been apparently shot down on the 22nd of April. There was evidence and reports that 9 parachutes had been counted coming out of that airplane. So naturally, he figured I went right to the ground with that airplane. Was really concerned. He got a letter from the chaplain and telling them that if they ever heard anything, they'd sure advise them. There was a French lady, I told back in on July the 3rd, wherever I was at that time, I had told that family, and they'd sit around and I'd talk in English and they'd talk in French, or they'd talk, and sometimes there would be somebody there that could understand some, and I'd told them that that day my daughter was born. Well, it turned out that she was born on July the 3rd of 1944. And so I had celebrated on the right day over there, but they couldn't understand. And this lady, she got very concerned that my wife, who had given birth to my child, didn't know that I was alive. And she asked if it would be possible that my wife could recognize my writing if I printed it. And I told her probably so. So she brought me a card she had gotten from the French Red Cross. And I printed a message. And I've forgotten, I think my name was Jean or something. And that I hope to be able to see her and visit America after the war. Now that lady got that card into the French Red Cross, who in turn transferred that card to the German Red Cross, who in turn transferred the card to the Swiss Red Cross, who got it to the American Red Cross, and 6 months after I got home, my wife received that card. And I always sort of appreciated the fact that that lady was that concerned about me. As we went on, I thought, well, maybe they'll take me to Paris. That sounds like a big city and a good place to go. I never got to Paris. They took me to the east of Paris, on south. All of the stops that I made were primarily in small rural areas. The French underground were vehemently opposed to the Nazis, and there were times when I thought they'd probably get me killed in some of the things that they were doing. One time I stopped at a house and they had, all the bombs that we dropped did not explode. Some of them were what we call duds. And I went into this house and I heard people pounding, and I went down into the basement, and there's two fellas sitting down there pounding on one of these big 500-pound bombs, because that person was going to get the powder and the explosives out of that bomb since it didn't go off. Of course, man, one hit with a hammer and that crazy thing could have blown us all to kingdom come. But, and they were very active at night in the French underground. On June the 7th, when the invasion of Normandy started, I was just south of Paris. And it sort of disrupted things a little bit, but they asked me if I wanted to go back up to the north and go through the enemy lines and through our lines, and that really didn't sound like a good suggestion to me, because the alternative was to keep going and go into Spain. Well, they weren't firing any guns down that way, and here I am dressed in civilian clothes, and by that time I had tried to grow a mustache. It wasn't very good, and they'd pencil it in, so I was beginning to look something like a man of the street, and so I chose not to go back up through enemy lines and through the American lines. I chose to go to Spain. And but with the Germans then being intent upon fighting in the north, it probably took a lot of the Germans out of the central area of France, because we really began to travel greater distances at a time, and longer during the day. And so as a result, my time was moving right on to where I could see where I was at and know that it wouldn't be many days till I was going to get out of France and into Spain. In fact, it took me a little longer than I thought, because on the 7th of June, there just south of Paris, it was the 6th day of September before we crossed into Spain. And that was an interesting experience, because they got us from all over. Now you got to understand, I was not the only one walking out. There were hundreds of military pilots that was walking. In fact, one man was shot down, and the last letter I got from my wife was that she told me in the letter that this friend of hers had been missing in action, had been shot down over France. Well, he got out through Spain in July, and when he got back to the States, he told my wife that John would be along, not to worry about me. He had heard my name in the underground, and he figured Seddon, there'd be only one guy coming out by the name of Seddon, and it must be me. Now, I don't know where he was at, but they must have passed messages around, and he had heard my name. The other thing was I didn't know it at the time, but my bombardier, he too had come out, had not pulled his chute, got on the ground, got going away from the wreck, and he came out south of where I was at because he come off through a part of what was Luxembourg, and of course this was all under German control, and into France, and he got out almost a month before I did. So, he either walked a lot faster or I just was slow. But some of the things that, another item that it reminds me that there in Belgium, back in Belgium, and I had no reading material. I had nothing that I could read. And in a house I went into, and the lady mentioned that she showed me some magazines she had. I just had to shrug my shoulder. They were in, I think, French. Most of those people spoke French and Flemish and German. They could use all three languages. But she left the house, and when she came back, she had about 4 or 5 magazines, and they were a set, and they were in English on a panoramic tour of the Rhine Valley. And I thought, boy, now what more apropos could you look at? Here I am, and she's got me these picture magazines on the Ruhr Valley, the Rhine. Another lady, she wanted to know if I could kill a rabbit. This was over in France, and save the pelt. And I told her, well, yeah, I could do that. I had, as a kid, my dad had raised rabbits when I was a kid, and so I knew how to do that. And so I get ready to kill this rabbit, and I'd hung it up by its back legs, and was about to cut its throat when she's, oh, no, 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 and run in, and she got a little pan. And I thought, wonder what she wants with this pan. Well, as soon as I bent the rabbit's head back to cut its throat, she put the pan up and she caught the blood out of that rabbit. Well, I then wondered, what's she going to do with that? Well, it turned out that she fried or they congealed the blood and had it as a part of the meal. It didn't appeal to me, and so I passed that one by. But the rabbit, she cooked it, and it was good. And she saved the pelt, and so she was happy. Another family fed me pigeon, squab, young pigeons, and she boiled those things in beer. I had never had anything like that, but it wasn't too bad. And another lady, she told me, she asked me if I liked pop. Well, I thought she was talking about soda pop, and I could not envision anything better than having a Coke or something after having not had it for so long. And she left. Pretty soon she come back, and she had a pail, little bucket, and she said, pop. Well, I looked in it, and it looked like milk to me. Well, it turned out it was the whey from butter. They had churned the butter, and this was what we would call waste, or the whey that was left after the butter had been churned. And for dinner that day, she boiled it, put a few oats in it, rolled oats, like we had, and served it as a soup. And then that evening, for the evening meal, what she had not used for lunch or for dinner, she put a little bit of sugar in it, and it was our dessert. So they really, used the things that they could get a hold of and eat. And they really fed me well. Well, when we got to the Spanish border, people had congregated, and at the house I was in, there were 7 pilots or airmen. One of them was a French Canadian, and he was having real trouble. He couldn't understand the French, and the French kept telling me, and I couldn't hardly understand anything, that he didn't speak French. And I kept telling him, he's a French Canadian, that's French. He didn't speak French. But finally, that night, a guide came, we followed the guide, he met 2 or 3 others, and finally there were 21 of us in a group, 21 Americans, French, or Canadian, French Canadian, a couple Australians, and English pilots and airmen, and we set off to go across the pass in the Pyrenees, but we'd be over into Spain, and then our orders was that when we got into Spain, we would turn ourselves in to the police in Spain and tell them that we were escaped prisoners of war. If you were an escaped prisoner of war, then they would repatriate you back to America. If you were an evadee, had never really been captured by the Germans, then they were to intern you. So they had some real rules of order. So we knew what we had to do, and when we had one man that was injured, and we took turns helping him to hobble along and get across, and it took us all night. We walked steadily with a guide, little road. I don't really believe it was a road that cars could travel on, but it was a road that people walked, and probably wagons and things of that nature had traveled it, and it was dirt. But about 8 o'clock the next morning, our guide, when he got us, went inside of this little town, and he described how to go in and where we would find the police, and he turned around and left, and we just walked in as a group, 21 of us there, into that little town. People looked at it. They were not surprised to see us because this had been going on. Apparently almost every night a group of people would be taken and brought to their little town. And the police, they knew exactly what to do. They set us down on a porch. They gave us some food and told us that the English would be by in a little while and bring a bus. And so I would say this about the whole adventure was that it's a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. It's not something you do. I wouldn't give anything for it, but I wouldn't want to do it again. Some of the other things that I just called to mind as I was thinking about this, the two fellas that had captured me over in Belgium. After I'd been in the States maybe a year, I got a letter from a court in Belgium, and they told me that these 2 men who had captured me had been sent to prison for their activities in helping the Nazis there in Belgium. And my name was one of them that they had listed as having been captured by those 2 men and was being taken to a German camp when I decided to sit down in the middle of that road and put on a play for them. The other thing is that here, when I came to Wichita Falls in '57, I taught school starting in '62 out at Ryder High School, and there was a German lady out there, and got to talking to her one day, and she was telling me that she went to the University of Frankfurt during World War II, and that her father was in the military and was on the Russian front, and they lived over in Leipzig, and that when he got a leave, then she and her sister, he would tell them to come home and visit. On this particular time, when he had gotten to leave, he warned them not to take the night train from Frankfurt to Leipzig because the English were bombing those trains, and she should take the day train. And so she and her sister boarded the day train from Frankfurt. It stopped in Berlin. And she said to me, she says, "You know what happened, Mr. Seddon?" She says, "I got off that train, and just about the time I got off of it, people started bombing the railroads and the railroad station. And if it hadn't been for a man there, a soldier, telling me where to go, oh, I might have been killed." She said, "Oh, I was really frightened. I was scared." And I said to her, "Was that the first time they bombed Berlin?" And she says, "Yes. Never had they done it in the daytime before." And I said, "I was scared too." And she looked at me sort of funny, and she says, "What do you mean you were scared?" I said, "I was 30,000 feet above you dropping the bombs." And she just started pounding on my chest. And since then, we got to be real good friends. And she worked for me in summer school several summers. And she'd get a little hefty sometime about what we were doing and begin to explain to me a better way. And I'd say, "Yuta, if I'd had a good bombardier, I wouldn't have to listen to you." And that would really upset her too. She'd bomb again. She'd tell me, "Oh, don't say those things, Mr. Seddon." But, you know, the real experiences, I suppose, I've got them in another book here. Let me get it in a minute. I've got a lot of these books, and with pictures and things like this. If you've never really seen a B-17, I don't know whether it would show there or not, but that B-17 was what I was flying, and this one here is all about our travels here in the United States. Now, I'm looking here. That one's not. Must be this one right here. Oh, yeah, my wife's handed me my B-17. Now, I don't know whether you can see that profile or not, but see, you had the bombardier sitting right in the front, then you had the navigator, pilot and co-pilot, you had a top turret gun, you had a turret under there. Man, I wouldn't have lived under that airplane in that turret for all the money. And then you had a gun sticking out each waist window here, and a tail gunner. That wasn't a good shot either. So, but all of those were 50 millimeter cannons and machine guns. They could fire a lot of bullets. One of the other things that we talked about, when you open the bomb bays under here for the bombs to drop, sometimes one of them would get hooked. It just wouldn't come loose from the bracket. Well, you didn't want to go back and land with that thing with your bomb bay doors open. You didn't want to close them with it hanging loose in there. So what would happen after you got away from the area of where you had flak and you know, got away where you could take a little time to think, you'd send one of your gunners back and let him crawl out there in the bomb bay and kick the bomb out. Well, it'd land out only one, maybe in, you know, and both the Belgians and the French, they were really concerned about that. Why do they bomb us? With one bomb, come by and drop it out. And it was very hard to explain to them why they would do such. Another incident along that same line was that I was in France, and the day before, or maybe 2 days, some people had been killed. And they had a funeral procession. And lo and behold, a P-51, one of our fighter planes, strafed that funeral procession. Well, they come back, boy, a lot of them was really mad. And they kept telling me about it. And I kept telling them, you know, I didn't want to fess up that it was a P-51, an American pilot. I kept telling them, must have been an English Spitfire. They don't see as well. And I don't think I convinced anybody, but I didn't want to be sitting around there while they were talking about that. And I don't know just where my book is at. That's got all my war stories in it. When I came back to the States, of course, I got a hero's welcome. this one don't have them in. Small town that I was graduated from high school in, where I got married at, was Farmington, Illinois. And of course I made a lot of speeches to the clubs and activities and hit the newspapers and all of those kind of things. But I'll tell you what, my crew, the other 8 members that were taken prisoner of war, were in prisoner of war camps, Stalag 3 and Stalag 11. And they had to stay over there until the war was over, until they were released from the prisoner of war camps. 4 of those men were from Philadelphia. One was from Louisville, Kentucky. One was from Spokane, Washington. He's a bombardier that came back out. But the whole crew, all 10 members of the crew, survived that evening of April the 22nd of 1944. I hope this gives you some insight into one man's adventure on one particular day that extended for 6 months. When I got into Spain and they picked us up in the bus, they took us down to Barcelona. And at Barcelona, they loaded us into an English transport and took us back to London. And there we spent 2 weeks in London being debriefed, describing everything we had seen along the way. At that time, the Germans were using the V-bombs, little engine-driven propeller, jet-driven bomb, and they were very interested in those, although I had only seen a couple sites because I swung south and did not stay up there in the northern part of France. They swung me south. So I really had nothing great to tell them. But took us 2 weeks to debrief. Then they sent us from there. We got on an American plane, flew us back to the States. When I came back home, of course my family, I had sent a telegram that I would be home before the
Chick season.
Before the geese flew. When they translated that and got it to my wife and to the family, it says I would be home before chick season. So they didn't quite understand when I'd get home. But after I got into New York, I'd called and took the train to Chicago and a bus down to Peoria. And when I got off of the bus, here I am, a fellow who had spent practically 6 months walking across Europe. My father was extremely beside himself, I'd say, after getting the initial information. You know, I'm the oldest boy of the family, and here I am, went down with my airplane and all of these great things. I stepped off that bus, and I had gained 20 pounds from the time I went to England than when I'm coming home after that, eating all those French fries across France. And I stepped off the bus, and he looked at me. And very few times that I know that my dad used any profanity. He said, "Well, damn, he's not even hurt." No, I had gained 20 pounds. Well, I'm glad to have been able to talk to you for these few minutes about that time in Germany, this trip. And if I was sitting here with you, I'd open one of these big folders up and I'd show you all kind of pictures that I have. But that's it. Thanks for listening. Hope it hasn't been boring. I'm now a real principal of history.